The agenda, we're going to talk a little bit first about the geography and demography. It's kind of embarrassing, but I don't really know how big Australia was before I went or what was the population. You know, like we were given briefing notes before, but that's really the first time that I really looked at Australia. And really, the whole mission was checking up on Canada's competition for global talent. That was sort of the name of the mission. So, you know, it's interesting that even me in international, I hadn't really paid a lot of attention to Australia. So I'll just show you a little bit because you may not have paid attention much to Australia either. Then I'll talk a little bit about the expression of interest and skill select. We know that in Canada, the expression of interest is going to be rolled out, I think, next January 2015, and explain a little bit about skill select to you and what that is and how it works. Then talk about international students, and then the settlement sector itself and multiculturalism, which was also really quite interesting and different. Some of the meetings that we had, just so you know, were with the Immigration and Border Protection. So, of course, ours is split into CIC and CBSA, but theirs is actually together. Trades Recognition Australia we met with as well. Australian Education International, so that was their version of foreign affairs. They obviously have an education sector within foreign affairs, their foreign affairs, which we do not, because our education for us is a provincial responsibility, not a federal responsibility. So our foreign affairs does have a small role in education, but it's constantly having to be very, very careful about what it says and what it does. So there's even a difference in how the government is set up. The National Office of Overseas Skills Recognition, and the Australian Workforce and Productivity Agency. So those are all actually government departments, which was, you know, interesting. Even there was differences to what we and how we organize our government at the national level. So Canada versus Australia. If you can't see that, you will get the slides, but I'll just tell you a little bit. Our area in Canada is 9.98 million square kilometers, and Australia is 7.69. So basically, they are 75% the size of us. Our population is around 34 million, and theirs is 22 million. Their largest city is Toronto, population 2.7 million, and ours is Toronto. Theirs is Sydney, population 4.5 million. So, you know, getting close to double the size. Their net migration is pretty similar to ours in 2012, 5.6 arrivals per 1,000, and theirs was 5.93. So, you know, we're not that far off, which is interesting in terms of new arrivals. And the proportion of population born overseas, we're sitting at around 20% now, and they're at 24%. So in terms of some of those demographic pieces, there was a fair amount of common ground. There's Australia over top of Canada. And of course, in Australia, where do they live? They live around the outside. And where do we live? We live along the bottom. And so their interior is much like a you know, moonscape. There are mines and things that operate in the interior of, but horrific conditions of plus 60 degrees. And of course, ours would be minus 50 up in a minus, yeah, hopefully not that cold. But yeah, it was quite interesting to start to see the similarities in even the population distribution. Although there's a spread around the island and nothing in the center, ours is spread across the bottom. So it's we have the same sort of very high concentration of population in a very narrow region. Some immigration comparisons overall. Funny enough, they have three main cities of settlement: Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. And those are sort of along the bottom, and Brisbane is up the Gold Coast. And we have MTV, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver. So that was really interesting. I didn't really realize that they have three cities and we have three cities that everybody wants to go to. They have special federal initiatives to attract newcomers to what they call the regions. And at first I didn't know what they were talking about when they were saying the regions, but they meant what we would call the rural areas, or the areas outside of our MTV, which may or may not be rural, but you know, it's the places that are outside of the three big cities, basically, and the three main states. They have, and of course, we have concerns over lack of immigration to the rural areas, but so far, we don't have any federal initiatives that allow somebody to immigrate more quickly if they're choosing an area. We have instead provincial initiatives. So they do have state management of separate immigration streams, similar to our provincial nominee programs. But in addition to their special ones, provincial nominee, they also have federal initiatives to help people to settle outside of the main areas. So that was one difference that we noticed right away. So we have, but our provincial nominee programs have some things in common, but for example, we don't have the investor streams anymore. Whereas they are just sort of reinstilling some of those investor streams. So it's kind of interesting. We don't seem to be in sync at all with some of the initiatives of Australia. We're, it seems to cycle around. We go with investment and entrepreneurial, and then we, drop it, and then we go back. So they're in a different place in the cycle than us. In Australia, their target for immigration was 190,000 last year, and it's going to be 190,000 again this year. And this is for economic immigration. This includes 61,000 spaces for their families. So in their economic stream, they actually include spaces for their families. We admitted 260,500 last year, so our numbers are bigger, but again, we have a bigger population. And we have a separate family class. It's not part of our economic stream. We have a separate family reunification class that they do not have. They include those seats under their economic. Then they have a 20,000 for humanitarian, and they add an extra 4,000 for family reunification. And we admit 10.5% of our 260,000 are humanitarian, 27% is family, and 63% is economic. So when you look at the percentages, it actually works out fairly similar, which is interesting. So let's talk about the expression of interest. How many of you have heard of the expression of interest? A few of you. So the expression of interest is a pre-screening for immigration applications. So at the moment, if somebody wants to apply to come to Canada, they just simply submit an immigration application to the embassy in their country or the embassy that's responsible for their country. And the triage of those is done by the embassy staff. So they read through the applications and they say, this one is good, this one's not. It's led to huge backlogs, which is constantly in the news. New Zealand began the expression of interest, and Australia adopted it, and now we're adopting it. It's a pre-application. Your application will be screened not by a person, but by the data that you enter into the very, very lengthy online form. When you've completed that form with all your information, your work history, your educational history, your family background, your age, gender, and whether you're interested in living in a rural area or not, because that gives you extra points, and your language capacity. Once you've submitted that, it goes into the pool. It's screened by the computer, online, and you are then either told no, thank you, try again some other time when you've improved your chances or you've met more of our criteria, or you get a notification that you may now apply to be an immigrant. So everything that you entered into the expression of interest is not your application. Then you actually go back in and you make an application to become an economic immigrant. And this is for the economic stream. So the expression of interest is for the economic stream. So you go onto the EOI, you register, you're ranked as well at that point. You're sent an invitation or not. Then the assessment of the application is the same as the existing process. So in other words, at that point, once you've submitted your application to the embassy in your country, the process is exactly the same. But what it's done is it's cut down on the number of applications that the officers have to look at. Right? And so that's been the difference. Instead of the officers having to look at everyone's application, no matter if they've got pieces missing of it or anything, the person has to have their entire file complete when they do the expression of interest. Otherwise, it won't get through. So basically, the person is pre-screened, prepared to submit their application should they be able to. So it's quite interesting. We had sort of a little mini pre-test on, we probably still do, on the to find out how many points we have, so it's just sort of a self-test, like, oh, do you have enough points to become a Canadian immigrant? And you kind of go through and you put in your stuff and it pops out yes or no. But nothing was ever done with that. That wasn't used to triage anything. There was no checks or balances to that. So this was a way to make sure that the entire file is complete. And then, of course, if it's found to have any sort of fraudulent pieces by the officer, then you're not going to be permitted to become an immigrant, obviously. Yeah.
If it's for clarification or anything like that, please, but for the discussion, let's wait for that.
Skill Select, which is what this expression of interest is actually called, was implemented in July 2012 in Australia. So it's actually fairly new in Australia. It's only now March 2014, so it hasn't even been 2 years. What happens and what's really interesting, maybe I'll just go through a little bit more. As of December 31st, they had 82,000 had completed the EOI, with 54,000 invited to submit. So you can imagine all those 82,000 would have gone to an embassy officer, being paid to look at it. So those 32 extra, well, whatever, forget my math, are not being looked at. So that's a huge time saving and a huge cost saving. And so it's basically the cost savings and the time savings. And not only that, but also decisions are able to be made much more quickly because the officers are less busy than they previously were. And so that positions Australia to make quicker decisions for somebody who's applied in a couple of different countries. So their decision will come more quickly. The person will be more likely to move to Australia than if the person had applied to Australia and Canada or Australia and Canada. In the end, 54,000 were invited to submit, and they've granted so far 32,000 visas. So that means there's still some people that did not get through the application process. So whatever they put in the EOI that led to the thought that they would be eligible actually didn't turn out to be accurate. So this is what's amazing to me. So the EOI process, the actual time that it takes to get somebody to enter Australia after they've submitted, if everything goes quickly, is 8 weeks. Oh yeah. That was incredible to see. A work visa takes 2 to 4 weeks for Australia, which is also those are work visas only for skilled labor, foreign work visas. Yeah. So these are outside of Canada, temporary foreign, or outside of Australia, temporary foreign workers. Yeah. So to actually land, to be have the expression of interest and actually land in Australia as on the permanent resident visa is 8 weeks, and a temporary foreign worker visa is 2 to 4 weeks. So not really a huge difference. So what does this mean to employers? Well, we thought that it would be extremely significant to employers. We actually talked to some employers and they didn't know about it. So we brought that back to the federal government as part of the conference board sort of debrief about this, was that actually employers didn't understand very well what the expression of interest and the skill select was. The communication had fallen down somewhere along the way, which is not unusual. Employers as well are extremely busy and don't have time to read what looks like an extremely boring email in their inbox, like, oh, guess what? And an expression of interest is, it could be misinterpreted. When I first looked at it, I thought it was like they were looking for expressions of interest for maybe proposals or things like that. Like, that's the context that we usually hear about it, and so it's, it could be a bit misleading. So what's fascinating is that as soon as you're accepted into the EOI, so as soon as your file is determined by the computer that you are going to be invited, from that point, you are permitted as an employer to go into the database and look up jobs that you would potentially want to fill within your company. So the personal information is cut off, but there's a number attached to it. So if you need a mining engineer, you can go onto this database, pull up mining engineers that have submitted their expression of interest, and you can do Skype interviews with them, and you can do the whole process online. So you can do 5 or 6 interviews, because then you communicate with Skill Select. They set that up. You do the interviews. You invite the person that you select to work for you, and within 8 weeks they have their expression of interest, or they have their permanent resident visa. The selection of the willingness to live in a rural area gives extra points, which was interesting. So they actually, I forget if it was 60 points, something like that, but it was significant. It was like 10 extra points if you were willing to live outside of Brisbane, Sydney, or Melbourne. But they struggle with the same thing that we do. How do you get somebody to stay in the region and in the rural area? But one thing that we noticed through our entire visit was that Australia, being so well organized federally, and everything sort of under the same federal umbrella, is really able to do a lot more in terms of data and tracking. And so they do tell people, like, we will know from, that you've left, and there's nothing that they can do, but it's not a good thing. They're kind of told up front, you need to stay for at least 2 years. And we will be tracking you to see that you do. There's not really any consequences, but it's enough to let people know that, we're hoping that you're going to stay. The other fascinating, how many of you are in foreign credential recognition? Or have anything to do with foreign credentials? So that's a huge piece of the work that we do with immigration. And it's down to the level they get here. They submit their documentation to the engineering association, or the medical association, or the plumbing association, or the welders association, and it can be a very lengthy process, and they might have to do more upgrading. But the foreign credential recognition, because that's part of the national, like the federal government of Australia, and it's part of their whole package with the EOI, they're actually able to determine the foreign credential recognition before the person actually arrives. So they can have them credentialed with the correct background. And they use many different types of databases. It's not an easy process. They admitted that. It's very, very tangly. But they're better set up to do that and to have the person arrive with their credential already recognized. So they're doing a really good job with that. And it's also not necessary to have a job prior to arrival, which is the same as us. You can apply as a skilled migrant, and you don't have to have a job arranged. You just have to have the skills. But if you do get a job through the Skill Select or through something else, then you will be fast-tracked. We do have a mechanism for that. Yes, I think they do, yes. Or they focus on attracting specific skills at certain times. So they kind of have a list. So you know how we have the NOC, the National Occupation List? So they have their version of the NOC, and so they'll look and prioritize certain skills at certain times, depending on what employers are telling them that's needed. So it was all really quite fascinating to me. So I believe it was at the time, Jason Kenney was really quite fascinated by the expression of interest, and he's the one that really pushed that we would have it, and actually continues to talk about it. I've heard him talk about it quite recently, even though he's no longer with Citizenship and Immigration, but because he's with Labour now, then it's very important to him to see that come about. So that's been really quite interesting. But he was the one that I think first found out, and he's had quite a few people from Australia come to Ottawa to work with them and help them to do the to understand how it works and how it needs to work in Canada. All right, international students is my next what I found, of course, fascinating because it's my main role at this time. So there's 4.3 million international students in the world right now. So those are students that are studying outside of their home country. And you see Canada has 5% of them, and Australia has 6% of them. When you think of Australia's smaller population, that means per person they actually have a lot more international students than we do. The top destination is, of course, the US, and then the UK, China, and growing in their number of international students that they're attracting, and France, Germany, Australia, Canada, Japan, and all others. That would be in the all others, yeah. No, I don't, but we could find out. It's usually tracking. Yeah, it used to be significant with Africa and scholarships from they would attract students in from China and different places. In the Soviet Union, yeah. In the Soviet Union, yeah, that's right. Yeah, interesting. Okay. So that's just to let you understand what numbers we're talking about. So in Canada and Australia, in 2012, the total international students in Australia was 245,531, and in Canada was 214,955. So not too far off in terms of numbers, but again, when you think of population, then us being that much bigger than a third bigger than them. Yes, that's right. Yeah, we've been making more of an effort. What I love, and this is just a fantastic comment because this was what we found everywhere, data from Canada is an estimate. Yeah, of all the countries. It is slowly climbing a little bit back. There was a huge significant drop after the racist incident with the Indian students, yes. Yeah. A few facts on the international students. In Australia, the sector is worth 17 billion. In Canada, the sector is worth 8 billion. So that's tuition, cost of living, food, whatever textbooks, everything that an international student will spend their money on. So that was actually quite a significant difference, 50%. Really they're making double in the sector than we are. It's fascinating to know that. Of the temporary residents that enter Australia, so temporary residents would be foreign workers, international students, tourists coming on a visitor visa, we have the super visa, those kinds of things. Of all the temporary resident entrants, in Australia it's 19% of them are international students. And in Canada, 25% are students. So what does this mean? It means that Australia is getting a lot more foreign workers or other kinds of entrants. And they have moved into the foreign worker market. And we're really just starting with that, which is interesting and has its own issues. Tuition fees at the top universities average around $25,400 in Australia, and tuition in Canada around $18,500 at the top universities for an international student. That was interesting. I had no idea that Australia has 39 universities while Canada has almost 100. No idea. I thought that they probably had the same amount as us, but they actually, for their population, they have far fewer universities. So then their universities are also bigger, right? Yeah, multi-campus and things like that. They graduate their work visas depending on the level of study. So if you graduate with a bachelor's degree, you can work post-graduation for 1 year. If you graduate with a master's degree, you can work for 2 years, and if you graduate with a doctoral degree, you can work for 3 years. Whereas in Canada, it's you study here, get a degree that's at least 2 years long, and you can work for 3 years. So we have a standard, you can work across the board. Of their foreign students? I don't know. Do you know that? I don't know how many. No, not off the top of my head. It's a good question. Yeah. 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 I'm not sure. I know this is hard for you to see, but in terms of how many study permit entrants that we had in 2012, it was 104,819. So, and then the others were the foreign workers. So there's double that number for foreign workers. And then humanitarian was 21,000, and other, which would just be tourists or other people entering in on visitor visas, was 81,000. So 104, well, almost 105,000 entrants. And in Australia, 156, 641. So pretty close to the same numbers of students entering as of June 2013. So they are really coming up now. They're really recovering the ground that they lost. What was most fascinating to me, I have to say, I was just totally blown away by this presentation by a researcher at University of Melbourne. The data that they have in Australia on students that have, international students that have graduated. So we don't have data on international students that have graduated. We don't know whether they stay. We don't know where they work, where they go. We just have no idea. We know sort of if we look hard enough whether they eventually convert to permanent residency. In other words, that is, we are able to do that. But once somebody transfers to just a work visa after graduation, we don't know where they are. It's open. So the only way that we would really know that would be where they were. We could rely on self-reporting, obviously. We could make a more concerted effort to ask them, where are you and what are you doing? But of course, that's only certain people, and doesn't give you the full picture. We might know it if we could analyze it against tax data, CRA data, but we don't have any ability to do that. So it's fascinating to me that they are able to know about their who is working that's graduated from their universities, and not only the international students. They know the domestic students as well. That was amazing to me. So international students with bachelor's degree have poorer rates of post-degree labor market outcomes compared to domestic students, 51% versus 81%. For one thing, I was impressed that 51% of their international students with a bachelor's get a job and stay. That was actually pretty good. Maybe we do as well, but we don't know, right? We don't know. So 51% of them are able to stay and get work. And 81%, which is actually pretty good too, 81% of Australians with a bachelor's degree are able to find work after graduation. It's good. BBA, so a business degree, and engineering graduates at the bachelor's level from non-English speaking countries, so they actually have that level of data, have a 40% chance of working after graduation. So that was really interesting because, especially with the engineering, because they're graduating with an Australian credential, which is really, quite fascinating that only, but if they're coming from a non-English speaking country, they have only a 40% chance of finding work. They just have, it's all federal, so they just have the data. It's completely up to date. Yeah. Not necessarily. Not from, it'd be the same with English speaking or non-English speaking, right? There wouldn't be a difference. So what they're saying is that the difference between international students that come from an English speaking country is different than one from a non-English speaking countries. And many of them do want to stay on their foreign worker visa after they graduate just a little bit in order to work in their field and then have a better chance to go back. We have really quite high indicators in Canada of students that want to stay post-graduation. Yep. Yes. So so just to summarize for the people online, so that language skills should be something that is valuable to an engineering company. And yes, so the next piece of research that this same professor wants to do is on discrimination. So she wants to take it into that side and just try to understand what's going on behind the scenes. So I'm looking forward to that piece as well. The worst outcomes of all were the course-based masters. Those are usually one-year degree programs. They usually have an extra fee attached to them in Australia and in Canada, and less than 40% are successful in the job hunt. So that's that they said, just lack of time, lack of familiarity, lots of expectations when they did the course masters that they were going to get work after, but they weren't. So they're looking at that. Doctoral students have the best outcomes. 70 to 80% international doctoral grads do stay in Australia and work, and at the domestic level, they have 85% employment in Australia, which is good. It's higher than that. I can send out the actual PDF to all of you after. Yeah, so you can look at the whole article that she wrote because she has that all broken down. It's quite interesting. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. 50% is the average, and 40% is non, and then I think it's probably 60. Now we're moving into the settlement sector. So the settlement sector and multiculturalism. How many of you are here from the settlement sector, the association? Okay, good. Well, this was an interesting stat, the very first one, money, money, money. 450,000 million on settlement and integration in Australia, close to 1 billion in Canada. So we have double the budget to settle our immigrants. Quite interesting. Australia is still kind of struggling to define a pathway for foreign workers and international students. They use the EOI, so they use the sort of the economic stream, but they don't have a special designated stream. But we do. We have the Canadian Experience class, and so that's for students and foreign workers. What was interesting to me, because I worked with Metropolis, Metropolis is a think tank that was in existence for many years and is still carrying on, but it's a think tank of policymakers and government with academia and the settlement sector all working together to look at policy in light of things like gender and poverty and homelessness and security, things like that. They don't have a Metropolis. They don't have something similar to Metropolis. So academia doesn't seem to be as connected as what I see in, say, Atlantic Canada, where we meet with and the whole settlement sector, as well as the universities. But for me, I work more in probably the settlement sector in the university than I do in the academia. I'm not actually doing the research. But academia doesn't seem to be connected in knowledge and capacity directly to the settlement sector. Like they're both connected to government, but they don't seem to be connected as much to each other, which was quite interesting because I think that's different in Canada. And I just want to say this caveat: there were people from the settlement sector in Ontario on a mission, and so from what they saw, their impression was that the settlement sector in Australia seemed to be more of a mom and pop, like more of a dated approach, more church basement kind of stuff. They found here in Canada and probably it's related to the amount of money that we're able to spend. But a very sophisticated and well-trained settlement staff in Canada. Lots of people I know in the settlement sector here have their master's degrees. And so just very, very sophisticated, well-trained, they felt that Canada has really empowered the sector through resourcing it, through making contributions, funding, things like that. And overall, we saw nothing substantial regarding sort of an in-depth approach to multiculturalism. So there was a policy finally in 2011 that's actually called like a multiculturalism policy, 2011. I couldn't find it online. It said this PDF doesn't exist. So I'll try it again another time, but I was like, what? Whereas we are really strongly grounded in multiculturalism. We'll have sort of surface debates around our 1971 policy and the founding fathers, that whole idea. We'll have talks about it, but we don't change it every 10 years, for example. So they had something called a multiculturalism agenda. They didn't call it a policy, but they called it agenda in 1989, and that's the first thing that I could find where the government actually said something about multiculturalism. Whereas for us, because of the founding fathers, because of the French and English starting us out, I think that grounded us much more firmly in multiculturalism, which was also really interesting. What was also interesting was when we went to meet with their government, they actually started out by making an attempt to speak to us in French, which was really cute. There was actually no one from Quebec with us, but it was interesting that, well, when they did their preparation, the Canadians are coming. We should say bonjour, comment ça va? So it was really quite nice to see that, and interesting because you realize how we're perceived elsewhere. So yeah, it's quite fascinating. In the settlement sector, sponsored refugees. So in Australia, they have 13,500 sponsored refugees every year. In Canada, we have 7,000 to 8,000. So if Canada were to adopt per population, like that same ratio, we'd be taking in 20,000 to 22,000 sponsored refugees per year. Can ask, so anyone been around the association for a long time? I don't know, I haven't seen huge changes. We might have taken more proportionately to our population before. But in Australia, and again, partly we talked about it, has to do with their geography being very, very close to sort of areas of the world which have more poverty or more political tensions. Refugee claimants go straight into detention centers and are often deported very quickly. So they're really turned around quite quickly. In Canada, refugee claimants can come here, land, live for 6 to 7 years until they finally have their hearing, then do their appeal, and then, and it's quite a lengthy process, but they're allowed to get health care, they're allowed to have jobs, and they just sort of integrate into the system. But of course, if Australia had an open policy like Canada's, they would probably quickly be overrun. So their policy is more of a reflection of their geography. Who would our refugees theoretically be coming from? We have a small refugee claimants because we're nice to get to. Yeah. Yeah. There have been restrictions on refugees and I'm sure that will continue to go that way. We do sense that at the federal level. Yes. With the settlement sector as well, in Australia, they were more focused and more outcomes-based. Yeah. Much more focused and outcomes-based. So in Canada, somebody who's a permanent resident or a sponsored refugees, if there's time and place within the school, there's not a lot of pressure on that person to get out. And if it is, it's kind of more ad hoc. But they have sort of this structural planning. And so they must reach this benchmark for this outcome. So either it's a language one or it's a labor market one by a particular time. So much more managed, and they make a lot of data-driven decisions on what they have as their 3 pillars of settlement policy: language training, settlement programs, and case management. So we have the language training and the settlement programs, but I had to ask the settlement people from Ontario twice to explain case management to me. And they were kind of weak. They said, we don't do case management in Canada, but from our understanding, so again, this was the caveat from their understanding, was that had to do with the structural planning. So each immigrant is basically case managed. You need to move through to this benchmark by this time, and you need to have this job in this field. So much more hands-on. So they compared it to parenting styles. So there are some parents who are much more on top of their kids, and you have to study for this, and you have to do this, and you have to do this. So they really case manage everything. And then there's sort of the liberal parents that kind of says, oh, well, if it takes you a year, it takes you a year. So they said Canada was more like that. Some of them said it would be interesting to do a happiness study on the immigrants. Yeah, interesting. So that was also quite interesting. And as I explained, there was an agenda for multicultural Australia. Then in 1999, there was a new agenda for multicultural Australia. And then in 2003, there was a very strong reaction in Australia to 911. And so this sort of united in diversity came out as a new directions around a united Australia and more around assimilation. And that was amidst a huge national debate about multiculturalism and what should Australia do in terms of multiculturalism. And then in 2011, there was the actual policy, which was the first thing that I found that was actually called policy, called the People of Australia. And just there's a link here which you can look up. It was quite interesting. There was a multicultural fact sheet. So I just sort of put that link there for you to click on and take a look at some more facts if you're interested in that multiculturalism piece. It really was really quite different. So some of the sort of overall things that we brought back was that, the alignment between the labor market integration piece and the immigration piece was much better in Australia. There was really, really strong alignment. But there were some weaknesses in terms of communication to employers. But again, it was only not even 2 years in, so it may just take time and experience, and employers telling another employer, oh, by the way, I just used this EOI and it was really good. And so that was interesting. In terms of international student recruitment, we obviously are well positioned to do international student recruitment in Canada. There is more of a share there that we could attract. And definitely the recent Foreign Affairs Strategic Plan says that we should double our numbers. And from what we saw in Australia, there should be capacity for that. But again, that's going to be down to each province and to each university or college or high school. Data, like the data that they have, is just amazing. They update it every month. We are lucky to get our data, maybe a year later or 2 years later in some things, but it's broken down really well. They're looking to have actually live, live just-in-time data, so like you can actually look in and see, like, even, the past few days, how many entrants arrived. So they're really transparent. They're just very, very open and upfront with data. It's just really out there. And that's really helpful because it helps inform the policies that they have around settlement programming. And they're really focused on attracting work-ready immigrants. Now, they're not dropping their numbers for humanitarian cases. Those are staying the same. But in terms of attracting immigrants who then are going to fail in this country because they either don't have the foreign credential or they don't, they just can't get the job, they don't want that. They want to have people who are going to be work ready and who aren't going to come and then end up driving a taxi in Brisbane or whatever, where they have a PhD. Yes, if you're over 51, you cannot, because I went on and tried to do the EOI myself, just to see where I got. If you're over 51, then that's it. You're not going to be able to do a skilled worker. You could come as a foreign worker, if you're a really special foreign worker. So if you're like probably like a high-level oil and gas foreign worker, you probably can. Right? But it was definitely that was So lots of philosophical things that we noticed as well that we kind of picked up on. But again, they're trying to compete, and this is how they set themselves up to compete. It seems that Canada is looking to them as an example, so it was helpful for me to know where they are and where I might want to advocate and you might want to advocate for other considerations. So I'll leave it at that and open it up for questions now.